All right, this is part 2 of utilitarianism. Here we'll be looking at act versus rule utilitarianism, a distinction that Vaughan makes and which is a really important historical distinction in philosophy. It also is an important conceptual distinction because you can use utilitarianism in at least these two ways, and they're quite different from one another. So again, this lecture assumes that you have read the assigned reading on utilitarianism and listened to part 1 of the video lecture on utilitarianism. Right. The real difference between act and rule utilitarianism is what are we applying the GHP, the greatest happiness principle, to? Are we applying it to individual acts, one at a time? Or are we applying it to categories of acts and the rules that would govern those acts? So one thing to think of is if you're doing act utilitarianism, you might be asking, should I cross the street right now? Another thing is, which rule would be best for crossing the street? Just to cross at the crosswalk or to cross wherever you are? So with act, you'd be weighing things, but with rule, every time you'd be weighing things, every time you wanted to cross the street. But with rule, you'd come up with a rule. You could come up with it in advance when you were nowhere near a street, as long as you knew enough about crossing the road. And then you would apply that rule every time you got to a street. All right. So hopefully that little explanation will set you up to get the most out of this slide. So when we've got act utilitarianism versus rule utilitarianism, what we're looking at is, again, differences in what we are applying the greatest happiness principle to. With act utilitarianism, each act will be judged on its own individual consequences, and each act will be judged one by one on a case-by-case basis. This has a huge advantage. It's flexible because different cases may differ in ways that are relevant to your decision-making. With rule utilitarianism, each act is considered as one type of act, and the tendency to good consequences of certain types of act determines whether each act should be done. This also has an advantage. That's kind of the flip side of the advantage of act utilitarianism. Namely, while you don't get to take account of the differences between each case, what you do get to do is come up with this once, maybe revise it occasionally. But you don't have to think through the entire balance of maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering every time. Right? So you can see how in hospitals and for physicians and in healthcare policy, rule utilitarianism would be preferred to act utilitarianism. You can't run a system on judging each act case by case. You would need some kinds of rules or policies. And you could build in cases where you could have exceptions to those. You could build in exceptions to the rules into the rules. But act utilitarianism is much more flexible than rule utilitarianism, while rule utilitarianism is much more efficient. So with act utilitarianism, you might say lying to patients about their prognosis could be ethically desirable sometimes and not others, depending on the consequences in each case. But with rule utilitarianism, you might say, well, look, if lying to patients about their prognosis generally has poor consequences for patient trust, patient welfare, happiness and suffering, then one should not lie to patients. Maybe you decide with act utilitarianism that letting patients have the final say in their medical treatment could be best sometimes, but not others. Whereas with rule utilitarianism, you might say, look, if letting patients have the final say in their medical treatment generally leads to good consequences, the best consequences of all possible rules, then one should let patients have the final say. So for act utilitarianism, of all available acts, that act is right which best maximizes happiness and minimizes suffering for all concerned. With rule utilitarianism, you're not going to be able to set rules aside for convenience or expediency in individual cases. The most you can do is modify the rule. So of all available rules, that rule is right which best maximizes happiness and minimizes suffering for all concerned. Now again, it might be that a rule with exceptions or nuances built in is a better rule for maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering than a rule that doesn't have that. So let me give you an example, and this is related to who gets to access kidneys in our country if they need a transplant. Who is eligible for it? So in the early days of kidney transplantation, And by the way, we've always had a scarcity of kidneys in this country, meaning more people need them than are available. But in the early days of kidney transplantation in this country, the rule was no one gets a kidney if the reason they need it is because they rotted their kidney out with excessive drinking. That's called alcohol-related end-stage liver disease. So if they have alcohol-related end-stage liver disease, then they don't get a kidney. Hands down. Now, people began to debate this as there were shifts in the understanding of alcoholism, and as people started to say, well, look, that seems really kind of punitive. It doesn't seem like it's thinking in a utilitarian way. A utilitarian would say, what will best maximize the outcome of happiness being increased and minimizing suffering? And a utilitarian might look at that and say, this seems deeply problematic for the happiness and suffering of people who haven't been alcoholics and haven't been active alcoholics in 15 years, who've been successfully recovering for 15 years. That now that they put all this work in, you're going to say, well, you sinned as a young person, so now you can't have this kidney and you have to die. A lot of folks said that doesn't seem to maximize happiness and minimize suffering. They'll make just as good use of this kidney as anybody else would who had never been an alcoholic. And so the utilitarian says, look, we got to change this rule. We need a better rule that better maximizes happiness and minimizes suffering. A rule that says we should allow people who are in recovery to get these organs. Now, somebody else might come in and say, well, what about the rule that says just everybody should get them? Everybody should get them, including alcoholics who aren't in recovery, who are still actively drinking and have end-stage alcohol-related end-stage liver disease. Well, the utilitarian would say, does that maximize happiness and minimize suffering? No, because if those patients receive the organs, they will just rot the second kidney out. Right? With their behavior, they'll damage the kidney. It won't be as effective as if we put it in somebody else who will not engage in those kinds of behaviors, which are known to damage kidneys. So what the utilitarian does is settle on the one of these three rules that is the best. Now remember, the best for maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering. So remember, the three rules were everybody gets equal rights to access the organ, regardless of what their behavior is, or no alcoholics who have alcoholic-related end-stage liver disease ever get access to a kidney, or recovering alcoholics do get access to kidneys, active alcoholics don't. Now, the one that best maximizes happiness and minimizes suffering is in fact the one that we've settled on and that is deployed by the United Network for Organ Sharing, or UNOS, which is in charge of the rules for organ allocation and procurement. So this is an example of rule utilitarianism in practice. We're going to wrap up utilitarianism now with something a little bit more fun. Take a look at this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon, all right? In this cartoon, you see Calvin gets something right about utilitarianism as a form of consequentialism. Look for what that is. But he also misses something really important about consequentialism. So just a little backstory for Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin's this kid. Hobbes is a stuffed tiger, and Hobbes comes to life when grown-ups aren't around. So the grown-ups think that all the adventures he has with Hobbes are just his imagination. But we, who see these adventures happening in the comic strip, of course, know better. So here they are, they're outside playing. Calvin says, I don't believe in ethics anymore. As far as I'm concerned, the ends justify the means. Get what you can while the getting's good. That's what I say. Might makes right. The winners write the history books. It's a dog-eat-dog world, so I'll do whatever I have to and let others argue about whether it's right or not. Okay. So he does get something right about consequentialism here. It's this idea that the ends justify the means. But there are several things he's getting wrong here about consequentialism as advocated by John Stuart Mill. And we really start to see these in sort of the second half. One of them is that this way of thinking is not an ethical system. It is absolutely an ethical system. He said, I'll let others argue about whether it's right or not. He's actually advancing an idea about what is right. But then Hobbes shoves him into the mud. "Why'd you do that?" says Calvin. "You were in my way. Now you're not. The ends justify the means." "I didn't mean for everyone, you dolt. Just me." "Ah," says Hobbes as he walks away. So Calvin here has missed that utilitarianism is going to be concerned with the consequences for everyone who is affected, not just him. Right? He can't just maximize his own happiness. He has to look at maximizing happiness for everybody whose happiness is affected, minimizing suffering for everybody whose suffering is affected. Now, maybe Hobbes did this as a kind of lesson for Calvin. Maybe he knew what the lesson would be, right? But even Hobbes may have made a kind of miscalculation, at least in his own utilitarian reasoning. You were in my way, now you're not, right? This is one way to get Calvin out of his way. But are there other options that allow him to move around Calvin without pushing Calvin in the mud, and therefore produce less suffering than pushing Calvin into the mud and create greater happiness? Well, yeah, he could walk around him. He could choose a different path. There are all kinds of things that he could do, that Hobbes could do here, that would create a different outcome. So utilitarianism encourages flexible thinking. It encourages considering alternate courses of action that might do a better job at maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering. It encourages impartiality. It encourages big picture thinking. And these are some of the advantages of utilitarianism. As we move on to Kantian deontology, we'll see another view which is based on the notion that consequentialist thinking itself is deeply problematic inherently. And Kant will tell us, look, the disadvantages of consequentialism are that you are then dependent on the circumstances around you for what is right or wrong. And that seems like a messed up way of thinking about right and wrong. So utilitarianism has advantages, it has disadvantages. And Kant is one of the people who responds to the disadvantages by coming up with a very different kind of theory and way of telling what's right and wrong.